Well, howdy everyone, and today I'm looking at another of Sigma's newest lenses, one which could potentially become quite popular, the 30mm f1.4 DC Art. This is a long-needed update to the original Sigma 30mm f1.4 lens, which was well known for making nice pictures but having a multitude of optical problems, as well as poor autofocus consistency. Let's hope this new art version of the lens can redeem the faults of its predecessor. It's designed for use with APS-C digital cameras, which essentially means any digital SLR camera that costs under £1,000. It'll give you an equivalent focal length of 48mm, which makes this a very versatile standard lens. I think it's much better than using a 50mm lens, as 30mm is a much wider angle, but it's still zoomed in enough to emphasize your subject and give you a blurry background. Interestingly, you can physically mount the lens onto a full-frame camera if you're having some kind of camera bag crisis. Here's some footage taken on a Canon 6D. You get some pretty gnarly vignetting in the corners at f1.4, but stop the lens down to f2.8 and it goes away. Interesting. The lens can give you a very out of focus background indeed. The selling point is that impressive f1.4 maximum aperture, which lets in 8 times more light as your kit lens at the same focal length and gives you a much narrower depth of field. As you can see, the lens can give you some beautiful backgrounds, and the extra light it gathers makes this lens super useful for indoors or nighttime photography, or for video work. However, unfortunately, the lens is not image stabilized. Let's look at its build quality. The lens is not too big and not too small. It feels nice and weighty in your hand, and it'll balance well on pretty much any camera. It's a nice compact size and it feels like a quality product. It definitely looks the business. Except for that small front element, which I've never seen before on such a fast aperture lens. It comes with a very nice looking lens hood with rubber trimming. Classy. The focus ring is quite smooth and not too heavy, so good for pulling focus while you're video making. It's not damped though, so extremely precise focusing isn't the easiest in the world. The lens has full-time manual focusing, so you can turn that focus ring anytime you like. The autofocus motor is quite fast and silent in use. Thankfully, the autofocus was a little more accurate on my camera than Sigma's last 30mm f1.4 lens. All in all, the lens is built really nicely and it's a pleasure to use on pretty much any camera, even on a 6D if you're so inclined. And now for the all-important image quality. This is where Sigma's original 30mm f1.4 lens really struggled. Let's see what this new art version can do on my 18MP Canon 6DD. Firstly, with the aperture wide open at f1.4. The middle of the image is very sharp with good contrast, which is great to see on an f1.4 lens. Sadly, even in the middle of the image, we can see some rather strong pink and green chromatic aberration on contrasting edges, which gets worse when we look into the corners. Those corners are decently sharp for such a wide aperture, which is good news. It's just such a shame the lens is introducing so many extra colours which shouldn't be there. When we stop the lens down to f2, there's a little extra sharpness and the chromatic aberration is not quite as strong, and the picture quality in the middle of the image is fantastic. This is actually a very good show. When you stop down to f2.8, it's just as great, but the corners are still taking their time to become really sharp. At f4, we're beginning to see a really clean performance, and finally at f8, the corners become great. So what can we say? The lens is very sharp in the middle and the corners are always okay. But it takes a lot of stopping down before they become sharp, and generally, the lens's resistance to chromatic aberration is pretty poor. But it's a much better performance than the lens's predecessor, which I hated. It has its weaknesses, but actually, because the lens is sharp and punchy in the middle, I like it good enough. Let's look at distortion and vignetting. The lens displays a little barrel distortion, but it's not too strong. At f1.4 the corners are a little dark, but not in a very serious way. I was surprised by this, as the lens's front element is so small. Stop the lens down to f2 and vignetting is no longer noticeable. Overall, it's a pretty satisfactory performance. Some further good news is that the lens has a very nice quality bokeh. Those autofocus highlights look very nice and soft without any weird distracting highlighting. That's vitally important for a lens of this kind with such a fast aperture. On a related note, longitudinal chromatic aberration is a little bit of an issue for this particular lens. As you can see, the bokeh highlights are tinted green in the backgrounds and pink in the foreground. It's even still visible at f2.8. To be fair though, most wide aperture lenses struggle in this regard. The lens can focus down to 24 cm, which is a little better than average for this class of camera lens. At f1.4, the image quality is surprisingly sharp, getting fantastic as you stop down to f2. That's a great show. When you're working against bright lights, as you can see here, the lens performs fairly well. There's not much in the way of a drop in contrast, and there's only a bit of flaring visible, so it's not too bad. So overall, the lens's image quality may not be perfect, but it's a happy improvement on its slightly wretched older brother, and the 30mm focal length and awesome f1.4 maximum aperture, as well as its reasonable price, make it very desirable. If you're on the market for this kind of lens, but you're not impressed enough with its picture quality, then you might also consider Sigma's 35mm f1.4 lens, which I reviewed a little while ago. It costs nearly twice as much money as the 30mm lens, but it has absolutely incredible picture quality, and it's compatible with full-frame cameras, which is great if you ever decide to upgrade your camera. Another option is the incredible Sigma 18-35mm f1.8, my baby. It's much more versatile as well as being sharper, but it's also much bigger and heavier and more expensive, and it doesn't let in quite as much light. At the end of the day, whatever anyone chooses, the Sigma 30mm f1.4 Art is simply a nice lens for APS-C cameras, which will have many happy owners.